name is Paul Barron. Welcome back into TechPath. I do want to thank our sponsor today, and that is Tangem. If you're looking at going into self-custody, this is one of the places you can do it with. Very easy to set up, and of course, the cool thing about Tangem that I like is that it's got a great card. It works great with your app, and it's super easy to set up. So all you have to do is visit tangem.com. You can set up your own self-custody over there, and of course, use our link. You're going to get an additional discount just by using the link down below. It does help the channel. All right, let's get into it today. We've got Justin Drake, who is a lead researcher over with Ethereum, and we wanted to dive in. So Justin, welcome into the show. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so Justin, let's go into a little bit of the detail. First of all, I want to learn a little bit about Beamchain and really kind of give our viewers and listeners a little bit more of a framework of what you're up to. Give us a 101.
Sure. So first of all, the Beamchain is a proposal from me. And basically, it's trying to ask the question, how can Ethereum be most secure and most robust for the decades and centuries to come? Basically, how can Ethereum sustainably secure tens of trillions of dollars, maybe hundreds of trillions of dollars in the future? You can think of it as being a compilation, an amalgamation of all of the latest and greatest research ideas that make Ethereum L1 the most secure blockchain in the world.
Well, I think the key here with ETH, when many people look at this, obviously understanding the power of the L1 itself, but also just the flexibility of what the L2 architecture has been able to bring to the chain itself. When you look at the execution layer and the data layer, I was looking at one of your scopes here. You've got this on the application-facing side, and then obviously the consensus layer on Beacon Chain backend. Give me a little bit of any updates on this. Anything that you can share with us of where you are?
Sure. So the L1 is made out of three separate layers. There's the consensus layer that we call the CL. There's the data layer where rollups publish their data in so-called blobs. That's the DL. And then there's the execution layer, the EL, where the EVM resides. And what's the Beamchain is all about is this first layer, the consensus layer. And as you said, the consensus layer doesn't have to be super expressive because all of the expressivity and creativity can happen at the data and execution layers. So actually, this is one of the reasons why we can change the consensus layer so dramatically, is because no application is consuming it. So there is no requirement to be forward compatible. Now, in contrast to the consensus layer Beamchain project being a long-term project that will take several years, we are going to see incremental improvements in the months to come for the data and execution layer. So just one example, in the next hard fork, which would happen in Q1 of next year, we're going to have a 2x increase in the number of blobs. So we're going to go from a target of 3 blobs per block to 6 blobs per block. And it looks like the community has also reached consensus on increasing the gas limit. So right now we have a 30 million gas limit per block, and that is set to rise to at least 36 million. So that would be at least a 20% bump.
Okay.
But I'm hopeful that this will grow even further in the months to come.
What has been the feedback in from the dev community? Has it been embracing this idea? What has kind of been your understanding of where the devs are going with this?
Yeah, so I've put a lot of effort to try and build the existing devs and the researchers on the idea of the Beamchain. And the response after my talk has been overwhelmingly positive from new devs. So I've had 100 individual people reach out, and we have 8 new teams that want to build a Beam client. So one of the things that Ethereum prides itself with is client diversity. We have 6 existing consensus layer teams, and there's potentially 8 new ones that are coming forward to build a Beam client. So overwhelmingly positive. Having said that, I do want to highlight that there was some mixed reactions on Twitter. People on Twitter were a little upset by the fact that the timelines were so long, that we were planning so far ahead when there were battles in the shorter term to fight as well.
Yeah, I'm looking here at the Strawman timeline right now. You've got this, well, yeah, it is going out to 2030. Is there any potential of where any of these phases could move forward. I mean, building is in 2026, testing phases out in 27 through 9. What's the potential there of possibly seeing that earlier?
Right. So one of the things that I want to highlight is that this is about setting long-term foundations. So one example would be post-quantum security. We don't need post-quantum security next year or the year after that. It's something that we need to work towards, but it's not something that we need to necessarily rush. And all of the short-term performance upgrades that we need to remain competitive in the short term, those are coming in the form of the increase in blobs, but also the increase of gas limit, and as well, all sorts of innovations that are happening in the L2s. So one massive innovation is this notion of pre-confirmations. A pre-confirmation is a way for a user to know how their transaction will execute before the block is built. And what that means is that they don't have to wait the full slot duration. So on Arbitrum, for example, they have 250 millisecond pre-confirmations. And what I expect will happen is that the latency will go down to zero, meaning that it will be a single ping time from the perspective of the user, and there will be no overhead above and beyond that. We're also seeing a dramatic increase in throughput from the L2s in combined. So if you go to rollup.wtf, you have this website that shows you how the whole space of L2s is scaling dramatically. So I wouldn't be too upset about the fact that all of the security improvements take years, because ultimately what developers and users care about in the very short term are performance improvements that will be coming in the short term as well.
Yeah, and I think where some of that maybe pushback from the community is coming because they feel that there are some other chains out there that have been able to kind of scale a little bit differently. If you look at just Solana versus Ethereum, this is one example. Could Solana scale faster in the same timeline? So one of the factors with that, along with others, there's many other chains that could possibly even go in there. Obviously, we saw some massive improvements here recently, even within Polkadot. So when you look at that and you kind of frame that around the rest of the environment of blockchain right now, do you not feel like this is something that is more urgent to try to squeeze that timeline down and still allow for the scalability to advance a little bit sooner?
I mean, Solana is interesting in the sense that they've been around for 5 years and they haven't increased their gas limit even a single time since Genesis. Yeah. They have a 48 million compute unit limit. They're looking to increase it, but they're looking to increase it by 4% in the next fork. So Solana has this design architecture where they're trying to stuff all of the transactions in a single server. And what that creates is a massive bottleneck because you can't just put all of the transactional flow of the intent of value on one single server. So instead, the better way, the more sustainable way of scaling is what's called horizontal scaling, where you have multiple servers, if you will, that are churning through transactions in parallel. And this is exactly what we're seeing with the L2s. Each L2 you can think of as being a parallel shard. And you're right that there's other ecosystems like Polkadot that have these shards running in parallel, and that is ultimately the more sustainable way of scaling. Now, one of the things that I do want to highlight is that there's two types of sharding or horizontal scaling. There's synchronous and asynchronous. And that basically has to do with the amount of composability that you get between the shards. Ethereum today has this weaker asynchronous mode of composability, and the reason is that each L2 has a separate sequencer. Now, the vision that I'm trying to advocate for is that the L2s start sharing the sequencer so that they can unlock this greater form of composability called synchronous composability.
Yeah, and I think you look at DOT, obviously, with what they've been trying to do. Sharding was one of the things that they did not necessarily like. And then you look at even Avalanche to a certain extent, what they've been able to do with their, layer ones or their L1s, subnets. This is intriguing to me because we're continuing to watch the evolution of where a lot of these blockchains in terms of strategy have been able to go forward. So I think it's interesting with what you're doing. And if you look at some of the things that people are complaining about, one of the big ones is cost, okay? And that is a factor, I think, in anytime you're building. Here's a good example. This is Universal Page. They were leaving Base. There were some reasons for this. If you look down in the article and why they were kind of dealing with this was because Base was doing a competitive smart wallet. So that was kind of a little bit of conflict of interest there, within the Base ecosystem. But I could see this being kind of a scenario where some of these big chains are putting a lot of pressure, from a competitive standpoint of either competing products, competing solutions, partnerships, et cetera, that could all flow into that and really get us back into the case of, being somewhat centralized here. So how expensive is it going to be to launch on an L1 in the future, like just a regular business?
Right. So as you said, there are costs to launching on these L2s. Like you are inheriting the security assumptions, you're inheriting the governance, you're inheriting potentially conflicts of interest, and really the best way to launch is on L1 directly. But then you have other costs, which are transaction fee costs. Now it turns out that there is a way to get the best of both worlds, which is to launch as an app chain on top of the L1. So you're launching as an L2 or roll up yourself. So you make use of the gas fee optimizations, but you're not building on top of an other L2. You are your own L2, so you don't inherit all of the branding and tokenomics of another project. Now, the problem with the app chain thesis is that you are a silo right now if you have your own individual sequencer. And so what you'd want to do is launch as a based app chain, for example, where you're sharing the sequencer with the L1 and with other based L2s, so that you still have the composability of Ethereum L1.
So that's an interesting concept of going that direction, especially when you look at just the amount of projects, companies, businesses that are going to be migrating to blockchain in the future. We're starting to see a lot of Web 2 conversion now for use case, and it's happening more and more, whether it's retail, what we're seeing in gaming. Obviously, I think loyalty is going to be a big factor for a lot of business to start to go onto the blockchain with this. You've got L2 somewhat being fragmented here. Why would a developer not just go ahead and select a Polkadot or an Avalanche, where it's a completely different scenario there versus what you're proposing?
Right. So one of the unique value propositions of Ethereum is, number one, security, shared security, very, very large amounts of economic security. We have roughly $130 billion of economic security. Just as a point of comparison, this is more than 10 times Bitcoin. So we have extremely high grade security. And we're basically selling this idea that you can build money Legos that are going to last for decades and centuries. And then the second big selling point is network effects around value that is on Ethereum. And right now there's about $700 billion of value that is being secured by Ethereum. And right now, you are right that we are seeing a fragmentation of liquidity and network effects because of each L2 being its own silo. This can be fixed, again, with the real-time proving and the shared sequencing. The first one is a pure technical problem. I think we're going to have that solved by the end of next year. The other one is an incentives and coordination problem. And I think we are going to see individual clusters of L2s first experiment with shared sequencing, and then eventually have an Ethereum-wide shared sequencer.
All right, so I get it, and I feel like from a standpoint of infrastructure with what we're building with right now. Now, a lot of people, maybe watching this right now. I want you guys to think about this from a standpoint, because we don't want to get too technical, of when really the internet was being built. If you look at it, that's exactly the phase in which early blockchains are today, and that is building the next internet. So a lot of this technology is being modeled around how do you scale it, the best way to scale it. These kind of proposals are the ones that are coming up. So I like the fact that that's going. Now, one thing it does bring in, all of this, is kind of a new function around staking, which is very important because this is a strategy within blockchain. You look at the changes of staking going down from what used to be 32 ETH now down to 1. I mean, if ETH's value is going to continue to accelerate, now let's say ETH goes to 10,000 and the value of the network continues to climb, a 1 ETH is still $10,000 to get one staked. So do you think that has any deterrence for people to possibly get involved a little bit more?
So one of the really exciting research ideas that we have recently is called rainbow staking, where there's actually different stakers with different responsibilities. So you could imagine one type of staker, which is an inclusionless staker, where they basically force include transactions on Ethereum if there were any censorship. And for that, we can have extremely low amounts of deposits to become such a staker, such as 0.1 or even less. On the other hand, there's this notion of staking to produce finality. And for that, what we need to do is aggregate tens of thousands, potentially more, of signatures, one signature per staker within a very small amount of time, within one slot, which is just a few seconds. And here there's just some hard engineering and physical constraints. So we can't have too many consensus participants within any given slot. Which is in contrast to the inclusion list where you just need one person to be active per slot.
Right, right. Okay, so what about liquid staking? Is that a threat to staking in general on something like Ethereum right now? I mean, you look at DeFi Llama. Here's Lido right there. This is a good example. The growth of just what we've seen within staked ETH over time has continued to climb. Do you feel like liquid staking could be an immediate threat to Ethereum?
So liquid staking is definitely not an immediate threat, but it could be a long-term threat. And let me try and explain why. The reason is that the way that the incentives are currently designed is for any rational ETH holder to eventually become an ETH staker. And the reason is that there will always be a positive yield of about 2% to become a staker. And what we should expect, therefore, is maybe the unit of account on Ethereum to change from raw ETH to something like an STETH, a Lido ETH. Yeah. And by changing this unit of account, we potentially jeopardize the moneyness, the monetary premium of ETHRD asset. And the reason is that we go from a pristine collateral to something that has a new brand, a new security assumption, governance risk, smart contract risk. And so one of the big research directions right now is, can we change the issuance curve to make sure that there will be less than half of all ETH staked? And if we have less than all ETH staked, it means that at least half of it is raw and pristine, and that is probably sufficient to keep the monetary premium of ETH.
So, okay, so you mentioned that you feel like any reasonable ETH holder would be a staker in the future. You're talking about still long-term effect on what liquid staking would do to ETH in a general. If you flip over and take a look at what Cardano has been able to do, this is direct access. Native staking is going to be available. Do you think that in itself is, and plus when you look at it, there's no lock-in. That's the other factor that I think plays into this. Do you think that would be something that Ethereum eventually would be able to do? No lock-in, obviously direct access to staking versus going through all the hoops to go out and stake your ETH.
Right. So there's staking and there's staking. So on Ethereum, we've taken the hard path where we have slashable economic security. What that means is that if there is a finality fault, meaning there's two inconsistent checkpoints that get finalized, we have this guarantee that at least 1/3 of all ETH staked is going to get slashed. And so there's like an actual dollar amount on attacking Ethereum, and that dollar amount is on the order of $40 billion. Now, on a chain like Cardano, where they don't have slashing, there is no such dollar amount. So in theory, an attacker can go attack Cardano and get out scot-free without any penalty. And the problem is that if you're securing tens of trillions or hundreds of trillions of dollars on your chain, there is going to be a reward for making the attack. And so we want to make sure that at any given point in time, the penalty of doing the reward is much, much greater than after doing the attack is much, much greater than the reward. And unfortunately on Cardano, that's maybe not the case.
I see. Okay. All right. Well, that would make a good argument. Okay. So let's look at tokenomics for a second. You look at since the merge, we've been ETH supply declining there in terms of inflationary scenarios, but here recent, obviously we've seen from right there around April this year, we've started to see this increase. What is the potential right now in terms of tokenomics? And also just, I think in general, how people look at ETH as an, you know, an asset that is quite a bit different than any other asset out there on the market, especially if you look at Bitcoin. Is there a potential here for changing up the tokenomics?
So I'd say the tokenomics today are already pretty good. If you click on the little BTC button on that website, and so you see Bitcoin has inflated about $60 billion in the last 2 years,
Sure.
whereas there's been virtually no issuance for ETH, the asset. Now, there is room for improvement. What we have today is not perfect. One possible improvement is, as I mentioned, to try and change the issuance curve to limit the amount of ETH staked, and in doing so, overall dramatically reduce the amount of issuance, maybe by a factor of 10. And then there's a second improvement that we're looking at, which is called MEV burn, which is this idea that all of the fees that come from MEV, instead of going to the stakers, to the validators, would go to ETH holders, to ETH the asset, in the same way that the congestion fees go to ETH the asset.
Yeah. Well, that would change things quite a bit then, I think, you know, from a sense of investment, especially when people are kind of comparing the two. And ETH, many people look at it as the chain that is truly maybe the next internet, especially when you look at the potential for a commerce side of it. So I would agree with you there. I want to get into a couple other questions. Which chain currently, in your opinion, has the best issuance to look to?
So Bitcoin has an excellent issuance narrative and meme around it. Unfortunately, the issuance of Bitcoin is not long-term sustainable. As soon as the issuance grows too small, the security of the chain is jeopardized, and that jeopardizes the whole project, including the token. So I'm long-term bearish on Bitcoin, you know, over a time span of a decade or 2 decades.
Okay.
What you want is minimum viable issuance. You want the smallest amount of issuance possible that still secures the chain.
Yeah.
I believe that if you target, for example, half of all ETH staked, you're in a position where you have a tremendous amount of economic security, half of the market cap of ETH, and at the same time, because you have this competitive dynamic where the different stakers are competing with each other to lower the issuance, you actually end up with very, very small issuance, maybe on the order of a few tens of basis points. And if we get to that point, the income for Ethereum from the burn in the form of congestion fees or MEV will be dramatically larger than the issuance. And what will happen there is that the supply would keep on decreasing sustainably until it reaches some sort of equilibrium. And if I were to make a guess, that equilibrium would be well under 100 million ETH.
All right, so let's flip over to memes for a second. You look at the success of meme coins within the Solana ecosystem. I would have to say that memes are where and what have probably kept Solana very relevant through this cycle, and probably has attracted a lot of devs just for the purpose that memes exist within that ecosystem. Do you feel like you're underestimating the power of memes, you know, within these blockchains, especially when you look at Ethereum?
Well, I think there is a lot of power to just pure speculation. And this is something that we have seen in Ethereum. We've seen the ICO wave, we've seen the NFT wave, we've seen the DeFi farming wave. And I think this is just a reincarnation in a different form of this gambling. And you're right, there are definitely advantages because it brings attention, it brings devs. But it's also a two-edged sword in the sense that, you know, easy come, easy go type of activity. And so what I'm hoping the Ethereum community can do is move towards a more sustainable direction where the innovation is real innovation, it's sticky innovation because it provides real utility for the world. And one metric, I guess, is stable coins. If you look at Tether, the stable coin, there's about $70 billion of it on Ethereum. There's less than $1 billion of it on Solana. So there's close to 100x delta between the two. And I think this is a reflection of the true utility that is provided to the world.
All right. Well, I think the scenario that plays around that still, to me, is drawing in the developers. ETH has had a very large lead for a long time. Let's just say it, you know, they're the granddaddy when you think about where devs are coming from. The key here is, are you winning the new devs? Because the emerging devs who are building on, you look at what Avalanche is doing with Retro 9000. You look at Polkadot, of course, trying to accelerate on transactions. You look at Solana, of course, with kind of the meme ecosystem, but also some very interesting DePIN projects. That's very attractive to developers. And at some point, you're going to have to continue to build in the infrastructure for Ethereum just because of the behemoth that it is. You're going to need to feed in a lot more new devs. What do you feel like your potential is there to continue to attract devs in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I have had feedback from some VCs telling me that they get a lot of pitches from very smart people who are young and thirsty, and sometimes they choose Ethereum, but also sometimes they choose Solana. Now, one of the things that I want to highlight is that all of the awkwardness and challenges that Ethereum has had is because we are the most mature. The scalability issues that we have is because we are the first one to encounter them. What I
Sure.
expect will happen is that Solana is going to encounter similar issues. We're already seeing the fees on Solana spike. And they have a modest 4% increase in the compute unit. That might provide some amount of relief, but ultimately they are limited to this design where they put everything in one box. And if you have a 10 gigabit internet connection and each transaction consumes a certain number of bytes, well, that puts a hard cap on the number of transactions that can be processed through Solana. What I'm hoping we can see on Ethereum is this horizontal scalability that will ultimately bring us to 10 million transactions per second. And this is something that could never happen on Solana with the current design.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's worth noting, because I want to go back to the statement you made about Tether and the potential here for it. Because if you look at what's happening within the stablecoin market in general, USDC, the fees in which Solana is very, very present within a USDC ecosystem. You look at RLUSD getting ready to launch. Why not? Go ahead. You're shaking your head. No. So let me hear that.
I mean, USDC is very, very little on Solana. It's 10 times less than Ethereum, and you have individual chains.
But very cheap.
Potentially, but getting more expensive, I guess, is the point, because they're starting to hit the scalability bottlenecks that are going to be much harder to overcome. You take an individual L2 like Base, they have more USDC than all of Solana combined.
Sure.
And Base is a 1-year-old project. Solana is a 5-year-old project. So it's very
well.
It's going to be extremely
difficult.
difficult.
You have to align that though. When USDC, it was really not much of a stablecoin. When Solana got launched, Base launched at the heat and the height of USDC becoming a global stablecoin. So I think that was a narrative that worked well with Base because it was the obvious choice. So I don't know that would be a direct comparison, because Solana didn't have that. They had to utilize Tether in the early stages of their development. So wouldn't you agree, or no?
I mean, Solana is
5 years ago?
absolutely terribly with Tether. It has less than $1 billion of Tether. It has 862 million. I checked this morning.
Okay.
And what we're seeing is individual chains have way more stable coins. Sorry, individual L2s have way more stable coins than the entirety of Solana. So let's take Arbitrum. They have 3.5 times more Tether than, again, the entirety of Solana.
Interesting. I like to hear these things, because these are the kind of details that we don't get a chance to see very often unless you're diving into individually within some of these development projects out there. One last point I wanted to make here, or ask you, when you look at MicroStrategy and what Michael Saylor has been doing with Bitcoin, he has been almost in a position. Let me kind of zoom in on this tweet right here. He's joining the NASDAQ 100 now. So is it a possibility? All this is based on Bitcoin as a strategic reserve. With your statement of that you're bearish on Bitcoin long term, do you feel like in the short term that someone like a MicroStrategy who continues to just buy up Bitcoin could eventually possibly be a top 5, maybe even surpass Microsoft in terms of market cap? What's your thought on kind of how that might transcend over the next few years?
Sure. So let's do a little bit of math. So MicroStrategy is about $100 billion. I believe Microsoft is something like $4 trillion. So there's a
Yep.
40x delta.
Yep.
Now, what I could see happening potentially is Bitcoin 10xing and becoming the size of gold. Now you'd need a kind of an additional 4x on top of that in MicroStrategy, increasing its BTC holdings.
Right.
I believe they have something like 2% or close to 2% of all the Bitcoin circulation. So they would need to bump that up to 8%, more than all of the Bitcoin that even Satoshi has. I'm going to say that this is extremely difficult to do, especially that in the meantime, what will happen is that more likely than not, the total market cap of Microsoft is going to increase.
To grow.
Then to add to all of this, as the years go by and every single halvening happens, I think the community will realize more and more that the Bitcoin security is unsustainable. And actually, I publicly challenged Michael to a debate on the sustainability of Bitcoin security, and so far he has not responded.
Well, listen, we would be happy to host that. So, Sailor, I know you're watching our show right now. There it is. Justin is willing to do it. So, and I think these are the kind of questions that everybody's asking right now, because we really are talking about the future of finance, the future of technology in terms of commerce, and really kind of digital ID. All of that we're really at the gates of a new technology forefront. So it's definitely going to be interesting to watch. Hey, Justin, it's been great having you on. Thank you so much for coming in today. I love diving in on some of this. I know some of you guys are probably saying this is way too nerdy for us, Paul, but we like to get these kind of details because this is an important side of where many of these chains are developing. And if you're investing in anything that's even Ethereum based, whether it's Ethereum itself or an L2, or really what could be happening within this ecosystem, you need to pay attention to the technology itself. So Justin, thanks again for coming in today. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You bet. All right, you guys, if you're not in the Diamond Circle, make sure and get in there right now. It's a great place to get additional content from us. We do additional podcasts, more research over there. And of course, you can follow me out there on X at Paul Barron. We'll catch you next time right here on TechPath.